Okay, so we can stay on time. I know there's still a few people to come in, but let's get started. Welcome once again to another one of the Road Centre Talks. Second one in a week, and rather different from the one that we had on Monday. I'd like to introduce Jens Beckert and Richard Bronk, author of this wonderful volume, Uncertain Futures. This event is also co-sponsored by Sociology. So what we're going to do is something a little bit different. There's not that many students here, so it doesn't really seem to apply that much. Maybe they're coming in. Usually what we do is we do the presentation, open up the Q&A, and then people begin to filter out as they get close to 1 o'clock. Today we're going to have our main speakers talk for about 25 minutes, and then we're going to have Josh Pacevitz actually be a discussant to set up the discussion. I would ask people that need to leave at 1 to leave at that point. So there's a clean break, and then we can actually begin the Q&A and then keep that going as long and as uninterrupted as possible. In terms of introductions, I will be brief as ever. Richard Bronk is a visiting senior fellow at the European Institute at the London School of Economics. He also used to work at the Bank of England, I believe, and also worked as an equities trader. Investment, for quite some time, and has written with many people who I like and admire, including Wade Jacoby, who's a wonderful Europeanist. And then on the other side, we have Jens Beckert, who is the director of the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Societies in Cologne. Jens and I go back a very long time. In fact, I, to a certain extent, owe much of my career to him. Because when I wrote my dissertation, I had this enormous theoretical apparatus at the front, which was a complete Rube Goldberg, and I had no idea what I was doing. And he wrote a piece in 1996 that basically said, no, what you're really talking about is what Jack Knight talked about as non-probabilistic uncertainty, and how do you do decision-making under non-probabilistic uncertainty where there are no priors to draw upon and the system isn't ergodic. And that was the ding moment. It went ding, and I went, yes, that's exactly what I'm trying to do. And suddenly I had a book. So thank you for that. So with that, by way of intro, it's always good to start with a bit of thanks. I will hand it over to the speakers.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very kind introduction, and thanks for inviting us. We are very happy to be here and present this book. And I hope, yeah, here it is. Yeah, so this is the book we will present. Not, I mean, the whole book, of course, but the main theoretical thrust of it. And actually, the main talk Richard will give. We just have 20 to 25 minutes, so we thought it's better if there's just one speaker. But let me just say a few words in terms by means of introduction. The book actually is in our collaboration goes back to work we did earlier. Starting with Richard's book, The Romantic Economist, which is a fantastic treatise on actually the role of creativity and the question of how creativity can be understood with the help of thinking that comes from the early 19th century, the Romantic or sentimental period. And it's treatise in intellectual history which combines economic thought with literary criticism. I started working on these topics of imaginaries and expectations in the economy in the year 2010, which then eventually led to this book which came out in 2016, Imagined Communities. And at the beginning, very early on, I came across Richard's book, and that was a crucial source of inspiration for me. And then I believe it was in 2012 or so, we invited Richard to a conference in Paris where he commented on an early version of an article that I wrote on this, and so this is how our collaboration actually started, which then culminated in the publication of this book. Now I cannot go into each chapter, of course, that would take all the time, but let me just say, I mean, this is here in a way a table of contents. There are 13 contributions. There's a 30-page theoretical introduction, and Richard will mostly talk about this. And then there are, on different facets of the topic, chapters that are written by sociologists, by political scientists, historians, psychologists, and economic historians. So it is really a multidisciplinary project, and all the chapters are on the question of how can we understand expectations and the formation of expectations under conditions of uncertainty, and what role do imaginaries, narratives, but also calculative technologies play in the formation of expectations in the economy. So just very briefly, the main argument that we bring forward in the introduction, the first step is to say, in contemporary economies, decision makers are confronted with fundamental uncertainty, which makes it impossible under these conditions to think of decision making simply as a form of rational expectations or rational calculations. Something comes in addition. And so the organizing question here is then, how do we form expectations and make decisions despite uncertainty? Yeah? So in situations where we cannot have this simply by calculation. And the response we give to this question is, yes, sure, rational calculation plays an important part in economic decision making, but so do imaginaries and narratives. And what we mean by this Richard will spell out in a minute. So outcomes are a function of contingent imaginaries or models and rhetorical and market power. Yeah? So the point here is to say that, yes, narratives play a role, but if narratives and imaginaries play a role in the economy, then they are also contested, and they are part of the power struggle in the economy and in markets. This leads to the plea that we need a form of narrative economics, or a theory of fictional expectations. That's the term, which of course relates to the notion of rational expectations in the economy, the term that I introduced in this book from 2016. Now, narrative economics is of course the term, I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, the new book by Robert Shiller came out under the title of Narrative Economics. And in a way, the book, our book, takes up same issues, but it is much broader than Schiller's focus on contingent processes of stories. So that is the argument in a nutshell, and now Richard will spell this out in a little bit more detail.
Thank you, and thank you, Mark, and it's a great pleasure to be here. So our underlying premise in this book is that dynamic capitalist economies are characterized by relentless innovation and novelty, and hence exhibit an indeterminacy that cannot justifiably be reduced to measurable 19 risk. In market capitalism, you face an open and indeterminate future. You're able to imagine and plan for an array of possible futures and choose between a large number of options without fully predictable outcomes. It was Schumpeter who first argued that the competition that counts in market economies comes from the new commodity, the new technology, the new type of organization. And the consequent process of creative industrial mutation, or creative destruction, he argued, incessantly revolutionizes the economic structure from within. Novelty and uncertainty are then endogenous to the economic system. What is more, global financial markets are interdependent networks that have all the classic properties of complex adaptive systems. This means they do not react to shocks by returning to some preordained equilibrium, but they display increasing returns and threshold effects so that small changes in initial conditions can snowball into radically novel and divergent outcomes. Ironically, another source of uncertainty and novelty is the neoliberal economic agenda itself. Continuous deregulation and policy reform frees markets from institutional constraints that previously channeled the sources of contingency. And more broadly, politics provides an unpredictable challenge to markets and, of course, the neoliberal agenda, as Brexit and Trump daily remind us in modern-day versions of Polanyi's counter-movements of social and political protest. So in short, we argue that uncertainty is a central feature of modern capitalism. And from this it follows that the future cannot be understood as a statistical shadow of the past. Novelty and innovation, if you like, break the predictable links between the past and the future, so that you cannot simply or only rely on statistics based on past data to provide probabilistic predictions. Nor can the past tell you what the correct model of the economy will be. What is more, first-order uncertainty implied by any particular innovation is compounded by second-order uncertainty about the creative reactions of others and the contingent nature of their interpretations of unfolding events. In short, in conditions of uncertainty, you can neither calculate the optimal outcome nor predict the future. As George Shackle put it, what does not yet exist cannot now be known. So this, of course, provides a significant challenge to standard economics approaches. To be fair, standard economics does take seriously information asymmetries and cognitive biases and other shortcomings of economic actors as knowing agents. But it ignores the indeterminacy and semantic uncertainty implied by novelty. Standard economics assumes away the problem of how expectations are formed and decisions made when radical uncertainty prevails. It conflates, if you like, Knightian uncertainty with measurable risk. It assumes the future can be predicted in probability terms, that the future is, in the jargon, ergodic. And crucially, it also assumes that economic actors converge on rational expectations. They will internalize the correct model of the economy and avoid systematic errors because they would otherwise lose out in competitive markets. Now, these assumptions might be valid in a world of stable parameters. But our argument is that when expectations cannot be anchored in pre-existing and objective probability functions because the system is indeterminate, then you have no choice but to rely on contingent imaginaries, models, and narratives. Imaginaries that both structure your expectations and shape the future in contingent ways by motivating behavior. So the result is that market outcomes then depend on who has the market, political, or rhetorical power to make their visions, stories, or models count. So Jens and I argue that economists should supplement rational expectations theory with, as Jens calls it, a theory of fictional expectations. When the future is not a statistical shadow of the past, we argue that expectations are fictional. And by this, crucially, we do not mean that expectations are willful fantasies. Rather, they are fictional in the sense of going beyond observable truths. They often involve an imaginative play with different visions of the future. And they're fictional in the sense that they usually adopt a narrative structure and often rely on rhetoric and metaphor for their influence on behavior. Where they differ from literary fictions is in their impact. If the imaginary is appealing, it often inspires action designed to bring that imagined future about. If it's unappealing, it inspires action designed to foil the imagined future. Now, fictional expectations are not, of course, normally individually formed. Instead, they are the product of social narratives and key opinion formers. Narrative entrepreneurs, if you like, who sometimes reshape the narratives that we inherit. And the crucial result of this is that market behavior and market prices reflect contingent and socially constructed imaginaries. Prices and market behavior do not so much reflect objective facts as how we collectively imagine the future will be. And as Jens says, this provides a key rationale for what Robert Schiller now calls narrative economics. And of course, it also explains why Keynes famously observed that traders are highly attentive to market psychology and narratives when they're deciding how to behave in markets. Now, it's crucial for the discussion today, I think, that calculative devices are instruments of the imagination. Fictional expectations make explicit and repeated use of calculative devices and models in a number of ways. First, they're used to organize and analyze imagined futures. Think of the discounted cash flow model, for example, which is used by agents to help visualize and explore, as well as value, options they might not otherwise have articulated. And a variety of forecasting models act as diagnostic tools for spotting emerging patterns. They act as scientific props for fictional expectations by calculating relevant causal mechanisms and teasing out such systematic regularities as may exist. In other words, we see models as stress testing imaginaries for plausibility and as helping to visualize and explore different scenarios. And the key point here is that just because the future is often uncertain does not mean that we can have no clue about that future. Models can provide us with informed imaginaries and support qualitative judgments. The output of the models is still fictional in the sense of going beyond established fact, but it is a reasoned and evidence-based fiction. Now, calculative devices perform two other key functions. First, they legitimize decisions and provide reasons for action, a social role that can be entirely harmless if their status as informed imaginaries is remembered. But if the calculative technologies are used to pretend that uncertainty can actually be turned into measurable risk, then they can pose a serious threat to market stability. What Michael Power calls the logic of auditability often incentivizes an unwarranted precision and leads to the danger of what Hayek called scientism, the application of the method and language of the mechanical sciences in a way that is simply inappropriate to the indeterminate, fuzzy, and complex subject matter of markets. And this in turn leads to a dangerous illusion of control. Secondly, as Donald Mackenzie has argued, models structure, they're an engine often structuring the future rather than merely a camera recording current pointers to it. For example, credit rating practices and finance models provide the very grammar and internal logic for structured finance markets. These markets only exist in the form they do because of the models used to structure them. But when this internal logic involves acute confusion between uncertainty and measurable risk, then these highly innovative markets using these models may reproduce the very uncertainty they claim to control. Now let me turn briefly to narratives themselves as an instrument of coordination and power. Narratives help make sense of the world. They give meaning to actions and create the commitment to act. We all use narratives to convey an imagined future to others and make sense of ambiguous situations. They reflect existing information and known causal mechanisms, and they are key. One of their key roles is to counter anxiety caused by uncertainty and create the conviction to act. They do this by providing a plot, a storyline of an imagined future, and an emotionally appealing script. They provide a logic of action by populating the future with imaginaries that seem worth investing in. They may take the form of new era stories or promised fortunes, and of course sometimes dystopias that must be avoided. Narratives also solve coordination problems by creating shared expectations, a common roadmap. And since narratives tend to shape outcomes if internalized by sufficient numbers, they become an instrument of government policy and political power. A good example of the economic power of narratives is the role of narratives and conversation in modern central banking. Of particular interest here to us is the use of forward guidance by central banks to cajole expectations in the desired direction. As Douglas Holmes, the anthropologist Douglas Holmes, put it in our book, communication has become for central banks the decisive means to achieve the ends of policy. Or as Ben Bernanke, the former governor of the US Federal Reserve, has put it, monetary policy is now 98% talk and only 2% action. And perhaps the most famous example of the effectiveness of central bank rhetoric was in 2012 when Mario Draghi, at the height of the Eurozone crisis, said that the European Central Bank would do, I quote, whatever it takes, end quote, to rescue the euro. And these three words are generally credited with bringing stability back to market expectations. So outcomes appear to depend on a struggle between different actors to establish their fictional expectations as the most credible. And of course, credibility is often fragile when you're dealing with uncertain futures. But narratives are not only a tool for coordinating and coercing expectations, they also provide the basis for two-way conversations. And Douglas Holmes, again in our book, examines how the Bank of England uses conversation with other market players through its network of regional agencies to access the stories motivating 6,000 different actors every 6 weeks they talk to, the stories that motivate them, and they use this as discursive input for their models and their forecasts. And this brings me to a central problem facing both entrepreneurs and policymakers in conditions of radical uncertainty, and that is how to balance the need to stabilize expectations against the need for open-minded interpretation of the unfolding future. An important example of this is in radically innovative sectors. Such sectors require stabilization of expectations. So promissory stories provide a shared script for the future and help coordinate resources for investment. These shared narratives determine which development paths are followed and which are not. And the competition to establish a dominant new era story and corner crucial investment is usually key to competitive success by startups in innovative markets. But herein lies a paradox, because it's well understood that innovative ideas are the product of cognitive dissonance, and that innovators must avoid becoming locked into one way of looking at a problem. They must engage, as David Lane has put it, in narrative shifting to make sense of fast-changing trends. So there's an important trade-off here between the advantages of shared expectations and the advantages of narrative shifting and cognitive dissonance. Aligning expectations too thoroughly around a dominant narrative risks undermining the diversity of trial and error central to innovation. Innovators, in other words, need to avoid an analytical monoculture while stabilizing expectations sufficiently to enable investment. And avoiding monocultures is also a key issue for policymakers and regulators. The key point here is that data and evidence are framed by the theories, models, and narratives we use. And this matters because all models and narratives are incomplete. They are simplifications. That's what it is to be a model. And therefore, if everyone relies on the same one theory or model, you get shared analytical blind spots. As Paul Feyerabend put it, there exist facts that cannot be unearthed except with the help of alternatives to the theory being tested. Now, this points to huge dangers in the project of constructing global solutions to global problems and the modern project of regulatory harmonization. It even calls into question the wisdom of the widespread discourse of best practice, because in conditions of uncertainty, you cannot know what best practice will be. And because there is a self-reinforcing feedback loop then between everyday practices and associated theoretical priors, convergence on one set of market practices and regulations, and therefore associated models, leads to highly correlated errors, It constrains how we think, if you like, as well as how we act. Likewise, as Robert Boyer argues in our book, the grand narratives that from time to time structure market expectations in conditions of uncertainty are prone to sudden revisions when that narrative is found wanting. And the sudden reset of expectations often leads to what is essentially a market crash. And it's for this reason that Wade Jacoby and I have argued for the importance of varied cultures of model use and a plurality of guiding narratives and models and the institutional preconditions for this to be possible. Avoiding analytical and regulatory monocultures is, we argue, a precondition for the stability of markets. Now let me finish by turning very briefly to the political aspects of our argument. There is, of course, something inherently political about economies built on fictional expectations. When the future is indeterminate, expectations cannot be fully anchored in facts. Instead, they have an important role in creating the future. And this implies that the choice of structuring narrative is the legitimate object of political contest and debate. And of course, it goes without saying that there is a very unequal distribution of the market political or rhetorical power needed to ensure that a particular story or model counts. And the same seems to be true in the world of politics itself, increasingly reduced to a battle of warring narratives peddled by powerful opinion formers. Perhaps because voters are increasingly faced by pervasive uncertainty and the anxiety it brings, they are susceptible, increasingly perceptible, to simple messages of "Make America Great Again" or "Take Back Control" that trump careful analysis and help provide the confidence and conviction to act. Jens and I have considered, this is not really in the book itself, but 3 implications of this argument for the populist turn. But I think we might leave that to the Q&A discussion afterwards, because we'd love to hear what Josh has to say. Thank you very much.
So I know we all want to discuss the book, so I'll be brief. It's a real pleasure to have been asked to discuss Uncertain Futures, which has everything you'd want from an edited volume such as this. A collection by leading scholars who speak to a big issue with implications for the rest of us, not just as academics, but as people trying to make our way in the world. Namely, the extent to which the economics profession and policymakers, regulators, and to some extent market actors by extension think about the future all wrong. And it is only bonus that the authors who are with us today, who also composed an introductory chapter that provides theoretical synthesis for the volume, are noteworthy in their own right for producing analytical frameworks for evaluating the economy and the political economy of the present, scholarship that takes us out of the current moment by allowing us to see ourselves within the long durée of history, thus making it easier to imagine what might come next. In sum, there's not much to quibble with here and much to praise. The call for narrative economics or warnings of the dangers of analytical monocultures, the advantages of narrative shifting, are all, I think, very well taken and likely to generate lots of discussion here, as are the various chapters in the volume that I won't discuss too much. In the interest of generating discussion, though, I will offer what I would characterize as some critical-ish comments, largely on the introduction and theoretical synthesis as a way to generate discussion. I want to speak especially to what is, I think, a minor tension in the book about whether it is primarily a constructive engagement with mainstream economics or economics as it's manifested in the making of policy, or more generally about how societies do and should imagine the future in general. As it appears in the preface, for instance, wherein the authors hope that societies will learn new ways to navigate uncertain futures that face them in ways that serve the interest of the many and not the few, unquote. Those 2 goals, I think, are not necessarily aligned, and that's the thread that I want to pull on in the discussion. What if we forget about economists for a second and think of this as a volume with something to say about how societies plan and forecast the future more generally? The author's synthesis of the volume offers lots of generative distinctions, for instance, the aforementioned difference between analytical mono and polyculture, but approaching the book in the latter way, I think, introduces 2 other distinctions which may warrant further discussion. First, do we want to make a stronger distinction between predicting behavior in particular markets or concrete institutions versus the economy writ large or macroeconomic patterns more generally? And second, to what extent is the correct distinction between analytical models on the one hand and on the other hand narrative, which the volume sometimes presents in effective or even quasi-mystical fashion? Narratives is that which sort of moves the animal spirits, for instance, and makes economic models believable. So first, markets versus economies. Here the key issue, I think, is between a synchronic and diachronic analysis of phenomena, to borrow a distinction from linguistics. A synchronic view takes systems as fixed with all relevant factors known and unchangeable, whereas a diachronic view is inherently relational and takes systems as just a snapshot in time that are composed of factors whose relationship to one another are constantly changing. Now, here, the key thing to note is that one view is not inherently superior to another, either analytically or otherwise. It really depends on the nature of the phenomenon under investigation. So, for example, it's perfectly reasonable for me to have a synchronic view of my own car, right? If the brakes are squeaking today, there's every reason to expect them to squeak tomorrow, and even more reason to expect them to deteriorate from there. It's a pretty safe prediction. But take my son, who unfortunately still wets the bed, to the great consternation of my wife and I. Sure, he's a stubborn little guy, and maybe that'll inform his personality in different ways as he ages, but there's really no reason to expect him to still be wetting the bed as a grown-up. The best thing to do in this case is just to relax and let the phase pass. The key problem then are when authoritative actors treat a diachronic phenomenon as synchronic. And here the theoretical discussion in the book is, I think, very right to treat this as a political problem and not merely an analytical one. In the United States, for instance, struggling cities are often prevented from engaging in social service spending by credit rating agencies which ding their credit ratings every time they diminish their cash reserves, right? Whether you think this is a problem or not depends entirely on if you think cities are more like cars or more like humans. And the analogy further illustrates that getting the answer wrong can lead to all sorts of pathologies that we're used to seeing in the financial system. Self-fulfilling prophecies, as in the case of credit rating agencies, perverse incentives gaming the system, and the like. So the question is, what is the nature of the thing we're trying to predict? And to me, predicting what will happen in markets or corporations or other concrete entities that are economic in nature seems relatively less controversial than when we think about macroeconomic phenomenon. After all, concrete markets are deliberately organized to be as synchronic as possible. So those familiar with the sociology of finance knows how much political, social, ideological work goes into making all factors knowable, transactions transparent, eliminating secret information, maintaining liquidity, and otherwise making the act of exchange as predictable as possible. Although we know also about things like performativity and the number of issues raised by Richard that make those kinds of assumptions dubious in many circumstances. But what about the economy or macroeconomic phenomenon? The key problem here is that the economy is not really a thing in the way that concrete markets are things. Becker and Bronk cite Polanyi to suggest that economic forecasting is flawed primarily or largely because it can never fully incorporate all relevant information about society, which is certainly true, but I also read Polanyi as making a deeper point, that our tendency to view the economy as essentially an analogy for the social is actually a recent political accomplishment. People have always traded in markets, yes, but they have not always viewed economic management as the superordinate concern of government. Our understanding of the economy as a thing depends, following Polanyi, on the political construction of one big market. And as we learned from my colleague in the sociology department, Dan Hirschman, it also depends equally on much work around generating economic indicators like GDP measures and others, institutionalizing their importance within the political field, and so on. And there's more than a bit of work that shows that policymakers adopt the apparently value-neutral language of economic management, especially during times of crisis, in order to avoid having to take sides in fierce distributional struggles. Here I'm thinking about Greta Krippner's work on the stagflationary period of the 1970s, for instance. So that's the first point. Doesn't the book's argument in some sense double down on an overstretched concept of the economy as essentially a technocratic analogy for the social when talking about predicting a macroeconomic phenomenon? If, following the authors, we really want to learn new ways to navigate uncertain futures, then maybe we need to talk less about predicting macroeconomic phenomenon and more about developing tolerant institutions, just governments, great societies, and the like. And sort of along these lines, my second point. What about prediction itself? By virtue of its engagement with economics, the volume often presents the choice as essentially binary. either the mechanistic logic of economic models on the one hand, or narrative, which the volume often presents as intangible or effective, as something, as sort of the secret sauce that makes economic models convincing. So there's a synthesis between the two, but those are sort of presented as the choices. But are they really the choices? Social science gives us lots of other ways to think about prediction. And in the interest of time, I'll briefly just mention two. So first, a number of fields, for instance, comparative historical sociology, have developed a subfield around the claim that narrative is the proper analytical approach for understanding the social, not because it is rhetorically convincing, but because the building blocks of the social are composed of sequences, trajectories, processes, self-reinforcing interactions, or other phenomenon that lend themselves to path dependence naturally. So what about narrative as an analytical strategy, one that may or may not be incorporated into formal mathematical models, rather than sort of a rhetorical device for making formal models more convincing? Or what about metis and practical know-how, to borrow a term from James Scott? Maybe the real issue is that since the marginalization of economic history within the economics profession, economists often tend to know much about economic theory in the abstract, but not always very much about real-world economies in particular. And it's these sort of abstract models that inform policymaking in consequence, right? So we would never train doctors or physicians by merely stuffing their brains with abstract knowledge about physiology. We make them do hundreds or thousands of hours of observations of concrete cases, and we do that so that they develop a tacit intuition about normal cases, deviant cases, how to handle deviation from them, and so on. But in a lot of cases, economists want to be physicists, and maybe the answer is not to turn them into physicists inspired by the poetry of narrative. Maybe we actually need economic managers and policymakers and regulators who think a lot more like plumbers. So anyway, I want to end there and turn it over to discussion. I hope this is obvious from my comments. I found the book generative for thinking both about the case at hand and for the big picture implications. No surprise at all given these authors, who I want to thank for giving us so much to think about and to talk with and think about, however that goes. Thank you.
Before we open up, do you guys want to respond? What was said? It was good.
Josh, thank you very much for these really insightful comments. And I'm afraid somehow, because I mean, not everybody has read the book, so I mean, it's probably a little. Let me maybe just talk about two issues. The first one, maybe two aspects: synchronic versus diachronic. Yeah, and here I think our thinking is that, I mean, modern economies are, in your terminology, diachronic. Yeah, and I would defend this also. Yeah, which doesn't mean that modern economies would not have very stable aspects. Yeah. So the way we formulate this is that, yes, in the economy, many things you can calculate. Yeah. It is really based on this notion of uncertainty. This is what interests us. Yeah. So it is your son that interests us, and not your car. Yeah. That is the point. The second, what you also related in this, I think there is really a scope limitation of the book. Yeah. This is not a book about what kind of imaginaries should we have, to structure a better world in the future. Yeah, the book is, I mean, in large parts agnostic about it. Yeah, it is rather on a meta level, so to speak. Yeah, to ask what is the role actually being played by narratives or imaginaries or also economic models in shaping this future. Yeah, and to understand this, on the one hand, as a task of coordination. Yeah, actors need to, in an uncertain world, actors somehow need to come together, at least partially come together, in an understanding of how the future will develop in order to make coordinated decisions. But at the same time, to understand this as a political issue,
right.
Yeah, where narratives here are really understood as part of the market struggle, yeah, or the struggle in the political economy. And I believe that, I mean, if you if you think of now really in the economy of innovative innovative industries, a lot of the competition there actually takes place without the product being there, yeah, but about narratives. Yeah, so I mean the whole idea of technological roadmaps, yeah, is a form of anticipating a future, coordinating it in this direction, but that is of course a very contested form of coordination, because some actors, be this government agencies, be this firms, yeah, have an advantage or disadvantage from this. Last remark that refers to your second point, where you say is this binary, yeah? And here, I mean, if I understood you right, then I would see a little bit a misunderstanding here. Yeah, our argument is not it's either narratives or it is models.
Right.
Yeah, it is rather to say models themselves can be a form of narrative and are a form of narrative. Yeah, which doesn't mean they are pure fantasy. That's again not the claim. Yeah, but they are they're in a way they are narratives in disguise. Yeah, and the way they are presented as a form of objective understanding of a situation is itself part of legitimating and making credible a certain narrative. So the two are, in our understanding, closely interwoven and not binary.
Right.
Yeah, that would be, yeah. And Richard.
Yes, I mean, I would entirely agree with that. I mean, narratives are embedded in models, both as part of the assumptions, and they also help to form a lot of narratives. So I think that's absolutely right. And I think underlying our analysis is the idea that celestial mechanics, as George Shackle put it, is entirely the wrong analogy, even for thinking about markets.
Mm-hmm.
So in one sense, or the other way, I would reply to your very valid point about why do we limit ourselves just to markets? Unfortunately, that's just what the book was about,
Right.
As opposed to society. In a sense, what interests us is even markets, which are these highly carefully constructed and relatively transparent phenomena, etc., have the diachronic and organic nature and indeterminate nature that makes them not really susceptible to an analysis purely by the models that help structure them. That's what interests us. So, of course, this applies even more obviously to the political world. And in fact, there's some work that I'm going on to a bit with Wade Jacoby again into the sort of epistemics of populism. I mean, this clearly has a relevance to a much, much wider area, but this is not what we largely looked at in this book. The only other thing I wanted to pick up on was your very interesting point about the sort of the analogy of doctors thinking about the future. This is something that one of our authors, Martin Giraudot, looks at, is the way in which models are used as diagnostic tools. And you could see in a way what we're advocating, to the extent we advocate a way of behaving, is as a kind of therapeutic wisdom version of judgment in markets as opposed to prediction. So the way a doctor, as I understand it, works out when they don't really know what's going on, what may be going on either with an individual or with a class of patients, is by using a variety of analytical techniques and models and a judgment and accumulated wisdom, using as much knowledge as possible, as much factual knowledge. And it's not an anti-knowledge, not an anti-fact point, but it's not something that is a mechanical derivation of a single model to determine what's going on, or a single algorithm, or whatever.
Right.
So, I mean, that's very much, we think, a central way of thinking about judgment in markets as well. And of course it goes without saying it, but even more true in political economies more widely.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, it's your book, so definitely tell me what it's about, right? And I should say that I'm going off my reading for the introduction, but as I read it, some of the chapters in the book are about dealing with concrete markets, and others are more about sort of managing macroeconomic phenomenon, right?
Yeah.
Because you could certainly sort of, have a model to think about what interest rates are going to do,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
what's going to happen with unemployment. And if you're sort of trying to predict what's happening with interest rates, in a lot of cases, that's actually a way of managing social conflict. We
Yeah.
know this, right? It's a
Yeah,
form of
absolutely.
macroeconomic
Yeah,
management.
yeah.
And there, you're not really talking about sort of a concrete market,
No.
right? You're
No.
talking about regulating the social in a
Yeah,
sense. And
absolutely.
so that was my
Yeah,
point.
no, it's a very,
different.
very valid point.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. And now we'll open up, but with the qualification that if you have to leave at 1, now is time to leave. Otherwise, we're locking the doors and you're stuck here. Okay, locking the doors. Вопросы, ребята. Questions? Oh, there we go, one on that side.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. I'm curious because you mentioned a couple times things like Trump, Brexit, the innovation economy, right? When we think about the uncertainty of the future and imaginaries and narratives and the role that they play in social and economic life, right? It seems like these aren't new things, right? To what extent is your argument, something that's speaking to a new phenomenon that maybe arises out of the disruption economy, out of maybe a climate of heightened innovation, and to what extent is this kind of always true throughout the history of, since there have been sufficiently complex economies?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and let me formulate it this way. Just talking about the economy now, yeah. If you think of the imaginary of a German immigrant to this country in the 19th century, yeah, then of course, there were all kinds of imaginaries associated with his or her future life. Yeah. So in this sense, no, this is not a new phenomenon. But then you may think about, nevertheless, something like a historical dimension in this, or a historical trajectory in this. And so you could argue, yeah, and this is an argument that is very elegantly brought forward in the book by Robert Boyer, yeah, scholar coming from the regulation school, yeah, interested in, these trajectories of capitalist development, who says that an economy that is, after the Trente Glorieuses, in the neoliberal times, much less institutionally regulated, yeah, is an economy that is much more prone to these narratives. Yeah, so it is narratives are then, instead of institutions, the coordination device. But it's a very fragile coordination device. Yeah, that's what is he is showing. He's saying, there's one of these stories after the other, yeah, hyped, and then falling down again. Yeah, and so if you associate these the life cycle of a narrative, yeah, with boom and bust, yeah, then we go into crisis. Think of the .com crisis, for instance, in 2000. Yeah, a hype in this, and then 2001, the narrative changes. Yeah, it's suddenly seen as unsubstantiated, and you have the crisis. So, I believe that there is actually a historical dimension, which does not say that narratives are only contemporary phenomenon. Yeah, but to spell this out, the question that you are raising, yeah, I think is one of the really interesting, partly also follow-up questions from this volume.
Yeah, and I would just add two small things. Narrative revisions, which Jens was mentioning at the end there. There's quite a lot of work now being done about how these key narrative revisions are associated with market dislocations, and that's something that we're very interested in. And I think also that the prevalence of innovation in the economy is not just a historical feature of which eras have more or less innovation. After all, there was a huge amount of innovation in many areas in the 1870s, for example. It's also about a way of working out the boundaries of applicability of what we're talking about. So we don't really have a problem with the standard micro-foundations of economics in those areas of markets where the parameters are pretty stable and where there isn't all that much innovation. In areas where there's a high degree of interdependent networks, globalized markets, and massive product and preference innovation, for example, financial markets, are the least likely place where we would expect standard financial and standard economics and financial economics to work. And yet, of course, it's precisely in these areas where the assumption that the future was a statistical shadow of the past was entirely incorporated in the basic logic of markets. So the value at risk models, for example, that were central to management in financial firms ahead of the stock market crash, explicitly pretended you could turn all uncertainty into measurable risk in precisely the areas where the product innovations were so rampant and so quick that even if they had had data for the last 5 or 10 years, which in many cases they didn't, it would have been completely irrelevant because the market had changed so much. So that's really a key point for us, is a sort of boundaries of applicability argument.
Next up.
Thank you very much for a really very interesting presentation. Just picking up on Richard's last point about financial markets, as an example, I wonder if you have thought, both of you thought further about this question of which narratives really gain purchase or become performative. And the financial markets case is so interesting because even on a quick glance, we know that there are all kinds of layers in financial markets. The product innovation tends, I think, usually to be software innovation or the calculative devices of the kind that you talk about. But these are not innovations that are widely understood, even by a lot of people in finance. So they begin to travel in specialized circuits, usually, I suppose, determined by markets in particular kinds of securities or financial instruments. But at the same time, there are financial channels on television, there are central bankers, lots of journalists who cover finance. So there's all kinds of information out there. And I wonder how we begin to make sense of which narratives begin to gain priority. Does it depend on professional worldviews or certified knowledge? Or is it really just a war of all against all out there in the information market?
I think Nick, you put your fingers at one of the absolutely crucial questions there. And the way I formulate this question is, I mean, simply what narratives become credible? Yeah, that's just rephrasing what you said. And nobody in this book, and neither Richard or me, have actually a theory on this. Yeah, and when I'm thinking about this, I'm also questioning whether it is possible to have a general theory on this issue, simply for the complexity of issues that are involved. But what you can do is you can start listing factors that play a role in this. Yeah, and so here I can connect as one of those factors to the book by Robert Schiller on narrative economics. He makes, and also in his earlier work, he makes a strong point simply of the role of media. Yeah, so you need means of mass communication. Yeah, to transmit, yeah, to diffuse these narratives. Yeah, and he has interesting observations how first financial crises, yeah, are correlated, yeah, with the invention of newspapers. Yeah, so media, yeah, certainly one aspect. Power, yeah, of the speaker. Yeah. Richard mentioned Mario Draghi, yeah, and of course this statement, "Believe me, it will be enough," was only a statement that influenced markets because of the unique power position of the speaker. Yeah, anybody else wouldn't never have gotten, yeah, this kind of leverage out of these whatever 3 or 5 words. And then I mean, just as part of such a list, narratives resonate also in cultures, yeah, or meaning they depend also on a cultural background and on an institutional background. So certain narratives, and I give you one example for this from the sociology of expectations and their investigation of technology development. So in the 1990s, the internet was declared to be the information superhighway. Yeah, I don't think that's even used anymore today, but then it was. Yeah, and so this highway and superhighway, yeah, is a metaphor that connects, yeah, to mass mobility, yeah, and that is of course connected to the individuality and the freedom coming with the car, and earlier with airplanes, yeah, and trains. And so it connects actually such a metaphor, yeah, connects to a certain cultural reservoir and values, yeah, that are that make an audience be receptive to it, yeah. For institutions, I could say similar thing, and then maybe just one last issue. Of course, you can also use and have to use really linguistic analysis for this. Yeah, so I mean, the question, what makes in literature, what makes a story, a convincing story? Yeah, how is the plot developed? How is the storyline developed? And how are the characters placed? Yeah, all this would also be relevant for an analysis of the question, yeah, what narrative actually counts.
As a historian, I'm obviously deeply sympathetic to this larger claim that stories organize the material world, and that particularly in the realm of the economic, the stories that gain a kind of cultural and political purchase ultimately determine many outcomes. So whether those are stories like more markets will always maximize human freedom, and thus we should pursue more markets for everything, or that carrots are always better motivators of human behavior than sticks, thus we should try to maximize one and minimize other, et cetera, et cetera. These have done vast amounts of work across human history. One of the ways that many people in a number of disciplines would talk about these stories is not in the neutral term of narrative necessarily, but as ideology. Yeah. And I'm wondering if ideology as a analytic term figures in your analysis, and if not, why not, and what kind of work might you imagine ideology doing as we talk about the ways in which stories ultimately reinforce and reinscribe unequal relations of power in the modern economy?
Yes, I mean, I suppose the straight truth is we don't really talk about ideologies in the book, but I think ideologies would come under the category for us of a sort of meta-narrative, if you like. And they very often do have a strong theoretical base, but not always. And I suppose another way of looking at what I think you're asking us about is that, I mean, one possible response to what we've argued is, so what you're saying is that the imaginaries and narratives that matter are those that suit the interests of those who promote them, or rather the narratives and imaginaries that matter are those who peddled by those with the power, the rhetorical market or political power to project them. So what does your analysis do that a political science focus on power or an economics focus on interests doesn't already do? And I think at that kind of nuts and bolts level, our response would be, well, in order to think about how economic actors in practice think about their interests, you have to consider the technologies of future making in which they envisage their own interests. So there's a beautiful example of that in our book by Jenny Anderson, who looks at the geopolitical power games in the Arctic. And her point is that the interests that the different players are pursuing in the Arctic are formed by their own, by a set of forecasting and normative images and historical narratives in many cases that give them their conception of their interests. And this is a contested field, what their interests are, because the Arctic space is only just opening up now. And likewise, power, for us, depends on the ability to create narratives that actually engage citizens' imaginations. So in that sense, the structure of the narratives and the granular features of the rhetoric actually play a part in the power, if that helps. Does that partly answer?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a Foucauldian.
Yeah.
I think we should just go back to Foucault and
Yeah,
say
yeah.
that Foucault helps us understand the economic world. And,
Yeah,
let's
absolutely.
Get on with it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let me.
He is not a Foucauldian.
No, I'm not. Yeah, let me.
Red
so-
rag, yeah.
Yeah. No, you see, I think the general field in which we are talking here is, I mean, we use imaginary narrative. Ideology is another term. Ideas would be another term. Beliefs would be another term. The Gramscian term, hegemony, would be other terms. So, I think the general point here is to say that the way interests are formulated and pursued is not just simply base, to use the Marxian formulation, phenomenon, but that somehow the superstructure plays a role in this. Now, ideology, again, in the Marxian sense, I mean, has this notion of false consciousness, and that you may attribute to some of these narratives. But then there's an additional phenomenon which I think is not well covered by the notion of narrative. Of ideology, and this is that in these situations of uncertainty, actors often do not know themselves, what's in their best interest, and so their ideas, or whatever you call it then, are neither false or correct. They are just something that needs to be put out, and somehow needs to lead to coordination. But I think once you bring in the power aspect in it, then you are, I mean, much more in a discourse where you can bring, I mean, notions of ideology or governmentality, the Foucauldian term, in, and I would go, and I mean, we would go, I mean, the power plays an important role in this, and so we would go fully along with this. I mean, these narratives are not innocent, that I think is,
Yeah, so I can think of two ways that governments pursue future making, and both of these, and I'm just thinking of examples that are just ripped from the headlines that are forms of industrial policy, because industrial policy is one of the key ways that governments pursue future making. So, on the one hand, you have investments in quantum computing, where it's not exactly clear what quantum computing would enable, but it's clearly been determined that this is a goal that we should pursue. And then the other example would be large state investments to pursue decarbonization of the economy. So in the first case, you don't really know what the future is that you're pursuing based on the investment. On the other hand, you have a pretty good idea of what the goal is. Now, how would your approach to thinking about narratives and dealing with uncertain futures help us to understand what would be the strategies for realizing one of those avenues versus the other?
Yes.
very good.
Very good question.
I mean, one part of my answer would be, and I know that is only partly your question, but the question again, why?
Back into the mic, can't really hear.
Oh yeah, sorry. Why is it? Why is the quantum computing more attractive than the climate? I mean, action on climate change. And just a partial answer to this, and I come to a second part of the answer later. So the partial answer would be that I believe that narratives that have a strong evocative power are attractive. So a completely new dimension of computing that allows us to do things that we cannot do so far. That is in a way, this far-reaching, imaginary that captures, all kinds of things. In contrast to this, having a different, the second narrative would be basically one of sustaining what we have, and that I think has a much weaker evocative power, than the first one. But that's only a partial answer. And the second one, of course, would relate to the notion of power, and interest and investment, private investments and seen profit opportunities, And the first one, obviously, these are largely private investments. The state is involved in it, but they are, private profit opportunity envisioned with this. The first one is one, which obviously would need stronger state investments, which leads to stronger taxation, and you have, organized interest in any capitalist society strongly operating against it. So this power and interest point would need to be brought in an explanation here.
A couple of sort of slightly more technical answers I might help here. Is I think where quantum computing is leading to data mining, that's in a sense the antithesis of what we're talking about, the role of narratives to make sense of. So if you're just looking for some random pattern that happens to be in enough data if you look, which is, I'm afraid, a lot of what quantum computing is doing. If, on the other hand, you're using models to spot emerging patterns in the data, so you're using a set of assumptions and a varied set of assumptions and a varied set of narratives, if you like, to help spot emerging patterns, that's something which comes much closer to what we're talking about, if you like. And of course, some of the essentially the panoptic state we're getting to with Google and Facebook being able to in real time read the narratives that we're all using in our emails, this in a sense is a kind of rather horrifically Orwellian version of exactly what we're talking about, of spotting the narratives that people are using to make sense of the emerging reality. That's a very different kind of data mining. So that was one point. On the decarbonization, I think one thing that would kind of fit with our theory is actually the old Elinor Ostrom point about fighting climate change, that what you do not want is global solutions to global problems. That what you actually want is to have a whole series of local trial and error projects to try and work out what works best. And that very often the tragedy of the commons things are actually easier to cope with at a local level where there are social constraints that actually do allow for some sanctions for breaking that than at a global level and so on. So that's a few little sort of thoughts about how our way of thinking might fit in with that question.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I feel a little like the lab animal listening to discussion from the scientists, since I'm a macroeconomist, and early in my career I spent a lot of time thinking about expectations. So I had one comment and then two sort of questions. The comment is, this idea that economists think of the future as the statistical shadow of the past. Mm-hmm. I think a little bit, you're presenting a caricature of that. Mm-hmm. It's true that sort of economists talk about models and say, this model is estimated on that data, mm-hmm. and it says such and such. But when real economists sort of talk about trying to understand the future, yep. They fully understand that a model is an organizing device, and they say, well, I don't actually like the story from that model. I don't believe that. Let me go back. What's the assumption I can change? How can I change the data period or whatever? So, there are obviously cases, like you sort of point to the credit rating agencies before the crash in 2007. I don't know that that was really like an intellectual problem, that they were unable to conceive of reality outside of what they saw in their data set so much as that was a corruption problem. that they were sort of intelligent people who had been incentivized not to think very hard and to kind of give good ratings to mortgage bonds. So the two questions are, one, long before Mark Blythe read Frank Knight, I was exposed to Knight's work in grad school. And
You're not that much older.
and I still have trouble understanding it. So, I still have trouble understanding what's so special about the non-quantification of uncertainty. So when I think about myself as an individual decision maker, by the way, I should say first, I think your discussion of narrative as a way of organizing, thinking about the future is spot on and very well taken and something that we all have to wrestle with a lot more. So, I think about the future. I've got to decide whether to buy myself a sports car or save for my retirement and what to invest in and so on. And I try to understand the future through a set of narratives. The democratic wave's going to come in and there's going to be high taxes and carbon tax and all sorts of things. Or we're going to have the zombie apocalypse, or we're going to have, neoliberal meltdown or whatever. Those are certainly a way I think about the future. But nonetheless, at the end, I have to put probabilities on those things. I don't think that there's anything inconsistent about thinking in narratives and thinking that I want to make a sort of weighted marginal, weighted optimization problem where I think about there are different things that could happen, but I need to put some kind of probability on them. And the second is, and here I'm really sort of outside my depth, but sort of understanding this link between narratives and power. So I certainly understand that people in power or market entrepreneurs or intellectual entrepreneurs want to sell narratives, right? And, another example you could have given was sort of, startups are always sort of promising software that they don't have, what they call vaporware, right? So I want to sell a narrative that's going to coalesce people around thinking that, this guy's going to roll out this product as a way of making that reality happen. But at the same time, it seems to me the history of kind of government interaction with expectations and narratives has a large component of those in power being unable to change the narratives. That sort of, from a macroeconomic point of view, what matters is what millions and millions of households think regarding the appropriate pricing of stocks or whatnot. And so, all the time, Herbert Hoover or whoever else is kind of telling you, oh, you're all making a mistake in your expectations. I'm the president. Let me tell you, this is how it's going to be. Mario Draghi was successful.
But most aren't. Yeah.
But so far. But lots of times that's not. So I think, you do need a theory of how narratives develop. But and maybe some of it has to do with power. But I think a lot of it is, in fact, this sort of decentralized formation of beliefs and adherence to narratives.
I would love to. Yeah, but these are also wonderful questions. So let me start with the first one. And there's very interesting chapters in this book on forecasting and actually how forecasting practices work. And of course, the macroeconomic forecast, they work exactly with these models. Yeah. And now it's exactly what you are describing. Yeah, that in the forecasting process, there is a back and forth. Yeah, where the forecasters look at the data, say, that cannot be really right. Yeah, go back to the model, talk to other departments. Yeah, how they think about this. And if you want to answer the question of why do we invest so much money in forecasting, despite the usually very often wrong point predictions, then I think you need to point exactly to these processes. This is where they are helpful, that they somehow open for these applied economists and then the people they advise an understanding of the different factors that somehow come into the situation. But what is communicated, of course, to the public, is just this point prediction. Next year there will be a 2.3% growth in GNP. And this is, misleading, of course. In the certainty, and it is so. The risk uncertainty distinction by Knight. And here, I mean, Knight is talking about the entrepreneur, yeah, and about innovation processes, new business models. And his distinction or is the uniqueness of the situation. Yeah, so it is something that cannot be taken from the past. That is the characteristic of uncertainty. Yeah, and I think if you want to formulate this in more, terms of economic theory, then not all factors, yeah, of the possible influences are actually known in the present and cannot be. So the set of aspects cannot be known. Now, it is of course right to say that we have to make at the end decisions, yeah, and these decisions are, of course, I think that's more likely than that, or I have hopes that this will be the outcome, yeah. I think the problem we point to is if the actors in this situation are not aware that these probabilities might be misleading, yeah, and come to, like in the wake of the financial crisis, to risk models, yeah, where a crisis is seen as way out of the realm of the probable. If this is the case, then the danger is that risks are not seen. Yeah, that there is a naive belief, yeah, in the objectivity of the model. That is actually, I think, the point we want to say. And then, with regard to your last point, we are not able to change the narrative. I think that is you're right in this. Yeah, one has to be very careful with just thinking about narratives in a totally instrumental way. Yeah, it's not that this can be steered directly, but of course in the macroeconomy there are attempts. Yeah, and Richard was talking about forward guidance. Yeah, to really, through these carefully, yeah, tailored statements of central banks to influence, yeah, the expectations of whole populations or the economy, yeah, and at least to some extent, yeah, and in some instances that seems to work also. It at least seems to have an influence. Yeah, it's not that these large populations, the narratives of these large populations could not be influenced at all. That would be the point.
Yeah, I think just to pick up on that, these sort of the models very often, because they're embedded in market practices and analytical practices, they become kind of reified models of the future, if you like. And I remember thinking back the other day to August. About August 2008, when the chairman of one of the biggest American investment banks said on the big public radio station, Radio 4 in the UK at 8:30 in the morning, what we're seeing every day this week so far is a 25 standard deviation event. Okay. Now, you can say he just felt he was incentivized to think that and to pretend that, but I think there is a sense in which Adair Turner, who was the chairman of the Financial Services Authority at the time in the UK, was absolutely right to say in October 2008, this is partly an intellectual error. Or as John Cassidy put it, look, you can't explain all this by greed and incentives. Greed is probably the only constant in the financial markets. So something changed. And I think that one of the things that changed was this overall narrative, if you like, ideology, you could almost call it, that it is possible to scientifically govern risks, to lower our overall risks and increase the returns relative to risks. This was a really strong meta-narrative. And you can say, of course, it suited people's interests to think that, but it took a whole lot of people down, who believed in it. A couple of other things I just pick up. One is about your point about probabilities. It's clearly absolutely right that we kind of, when we think about how we're making decisions in uncertainty, that we sort of say something's more likely than others or not. One of the chapters in the book that looks at credit rating points out that credit ratings actually have two very different logics. So sovereign credit ratings are sort of holistic diagnostic assessments of a country, and credit ratings for countries are ordinal rankings. So they are not a probabilistic forecast. They are, the US is less likely to default than Greece, and Greece is is less likely to default than Sierra Leone or whatever it is. So there's no attempt to actually assign a probability. There is just an organization, if you like, or layering of the dangers associated with investing in those different countries. And that's completely different from the cardinal risk measures of probability of default or of loss given default that were used in the CDO markets, for example, which really did rareface something. And your first point about economics, I mean, this is absolutely true. I mean, one of the many authors in the book is Andrew Haldane, who's the chief economist of the Bank of England. And actually, applied economists, I think, have made huge leaps into much more pragmatic thinking about exactly these kinds of issues. And our target when we talk about standard economics isn't all economists. It's a particular way of thinking about rational expectations theory and so on. And so I wanted to make that point. And one final point about Brexit and the use of forecasts, because I think it comes to one of your other points, and Jens's point. Forecasts are incredibly useful. As an ex-fund manager, why I listened to financial forecasts or economic forecasts wasn't because I was at all interested in the point forecast. What I wanted to know was why one forecaster forecasting this and why another forecasted that. It was to get at the causal mechanisms. But if you look at the way the forecasts were used in the Brexit debate, the UK government issued a forecast that said if you vote for Brexit, every family in the UK will be £4,436 worse off. And people said, you can't be serious. How could you possibly know that? Now, ironically, it turns out 3 years later that they are about 4,000. But that's beside the point. The point was, had they said, if you vote for Brexit, the danger is a sharp fall in sterling that will lead to higher prices and a fall in real disposable income, which will hurt the poorest households most, people might have listened. But by claiming a kind of false scientific precision of this point forecast, they really damaged their own credibility. So.
I think we're just about out of time, but I will abuse my position of power and narrative. Just to get a comment very quickly on you. Die schwarze Null, the black zero. If there's one thing that Germans love, it's paying back their own debt, which is also the same as destroying their own national savings, but let's put that to one side. Even IFO and various other institutions in Germany are now saying we really are in trouble, things are slowing down, we have tons of fiscal space, we really should do some degree of stimulus. We can borrow at negative rates or right across the long end of the curve. They're paying us to do this. And yet the power of narrative is such that they cannot and they will not do it. Is this a really good example of what you're talking about?
I guess that goes to me, yeah. Yeah.
Zum Beispiel.
Yeah, I guess it is. Yeah, I mean there are. I mean in economic terms there would be. Yeah, and good. Yeah, but I mean it's electoral politics. Yeah, that plays a role here. So there is a certain narrative and understanding in the German population. Yeah, as the German Chancellor Merkel said a couple of years ago. The state should be like the Schwäbische Hausfrau, yeah, and the Swabian housewife, yeah, or homemaker, yeah, is somebody who keeps, doesn't spend beyond her means, yeah, and so that is, yeah, but it is of course now in electoral politics. So if the party that the SPD or the CDU, if they diverge from this, yeah. They lose in electoral credibility, and that will be exploited by the other party. So that is right now the point. And I mean the Social Democrats, yeah, probably also parts of the Christian Democratic Party, they know very well, yeah, I mean the point you're making, yeah. But in the political structure, I believe it is they don't dare, yeah, to run the risk that they then become vulnerable, yeah. To the attack by the other side.
But this goes back to David's point, because then what you just told me there was a very non-narrativistic interpretation, whereby there are political actors who have these interests, and they're aware that their interests will be damaged if they do. It's nothing to do with narrative. But what lies beneath that is the fact that it doesn't matter where you are on the political spectrum, you cannot challenge this narrative. That's what will cost you. So they're two different stories.
Yeah.
And I'm surprised to hear you go for the first one.
Yeah. No, but I mean, in this story, I mean, what I'm saying is that narrative, yes, does play a role, yeah, and I mean here it's, I mean the point I think we made before, that narratives are also the object of instrumental political action, yeah, and not just something that is floating around. Yeah.
A good place to end is not just floating around. Thank you very much.